Warm greetings and well wishes, my dears. Can I get a drum roll, please? Alright, I suppose that will do. Welcome to Steeped in Irony, a channel that will one day be about tea. No part in particular, just the whole thing in general. Of course, it takes time to talk about every part of tea, so for now, we'll have to make do with just the particulars. There's a lot to go through with this one, because today we're covering the absolute granddaddy of tea history. We're going back to the source, the wellspring, the Camellia sinensis, if you will, where the humble tea leaf first decided to make a name for itself: China. Now, if you've been following along, and oh, I do so hope you've been following along, you know I love a good story. And the story of tea in China is basically a 2,000-year-long soap opera. It begins with a legend. Tradition tells us that sometime around 5,000 years ago, the mythological emperor Shen Nong, the divine farmer, was busy boiling some water in the wild when a few stray leaves from a nearby tea bush drifted into his pot. He found the resulting brew refreshing and medicinal, and just like that, the world's first tea break came about. Modern scholars, of course, are a bit more skeptical, suggesting Shen Nong represents a collective cultural memory rather than a real guy with a very lucky pot. If we look at the actual receipts, and by receipts I mean archaeology, the timeline is still pretty mind-blowing. The first big discovery toward our modern understanding came in 2016, when researchers, using mass spectrometry, identified pressed tea in the tomb of Emperor Jing of the Han Dynasty, circa the year 150 BCE. Given what we know about ancient pressed teas, that they were most commonly pressed for storage or transportation purposes rather than having any effect on the taste or fermentation process, this means that tea was already an established commodity in China, dating back more than 2,100 years. What made this discovery so groundbreaking was that prior to this, the earliest physical evidence we had of tea came from the northern Song dynasty in eastern China, dated to about 1,000 years ago. The 2016 discovery pushed the timeline back a whole millennium, and that isn't even the end of it, or the start of it rather, because even more recent findings from an excavation of a Zhou dynasty tomb in the Shandong province from 2018 to 2021 turned up tea residue on a bowl estimated to about 400 BCE. These discoveries predate even the earliest definitive written record we have, which is a letter from the poet Wang Bao, dated to 59 BCE, wherein he lists buying and boiling tea as some of the duties to be carried out by a servant. During this era, tea wasn't being consumed in the way that we think of tea now, that sweet, grassy, brisk beverage we all love. It was closer to modern-day butter tea or Atkin chai, basically a broth, hearty, salty, often with spices, grains or vegetables mixed in. And despite having established itself as a mainstay drink among the elites in Han Dynasty-era China, it wasn't until the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century that ordinary people began to drink tea more regularly, and it took on its more familiar form. While drinking it as sort of a soup was still common practice, particularly among common folk, tea preparation during the Tang dynasty most often began with pressed bricks or cakes, which were broken off and then cooked. Yes, cooked, either by roasting or steaming prior to steeping. And while it's somewhat unclear what purpose this step served, later Song dynasty traditions involved roasting leaves as a sanitization method, and it seems entirely plausible that this was its primary purpose during the Tang dynasty as well. And rather than being served as a caffeinated soup, these broken-off leaves were steeped in hot water alone, which was the first widespread account of tea as a standalone drink. This era also gave us Zen Buddhism, the school of Buddhism most responsible for popularizing tea culture in China, and by extension, the wider Asian continent. Zen Buddhists spent many hours each day in meditation, and were also encouraged to participate in artistic pursuits, as Zen teachings maintained that such pursuits were a path toward enlightenment. Tea helped facilitate both of these imperatives, as the chemical combination of caffeine and L-theanine helped them focus during these long meditation sessions without feeling wired or falling asleep, and preparing it was an exercise in patience and intentionality. But perhaps even more influential than Zen Buddhist teachings to the spread of tea culture across Asia was the writer Lu Yu, the sage of tea, who wrote the Cha Jing, the classic of tea, between 760 and 780 CE. During the Tang dynasty, Lu Yu travelled around China documenting regional tea practices, discovering how water quality affected the steeping process, and sharing what he'd learned with those he met. Lu Yu's travels and writings expanded tea culture in China from being a practice localised mostly to the southwest region into being a national pastime consumed by everyone from the commoners to the elites, and even those just visiting, such as dignitaries or delegates from other countries and merchant caravans. Then came the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279, which was the Age of Refinement. This period marked an artistic renaissance in China, and where tea underwent another important transformation. People began crushing the bricks into a fine powder, and then whisking it into a froth. If that sounds familiar to such learned students of tea culture as yourselves, it's because this style tea is what was brought all the way up to Japan, where it was popularized as matcha. In Song dynasty era China, this practice was called dian cha, and it was just as deliberate and ritualistic as its Japanese counterpart. Tea preparation as a whole was considered one of the four elegances, alongside incense burning, flower arranging, and painting hanging. But within that, dian cha had its own rubric. Whipping up the perfect froth was a distinguished and celebrated skill, and competitions were even held to see who could present the most pleasing cup of tea, with criteria including taste, aroma, froth consistency, and presentation. Because the elite were utterly obsessed with the aesthetic quality and longevity of this white foam, this new tea trend triggered a spike in demand for luxury ceramics and other tools of the trade. Suddenly, you couldn't just use any old cup. Ugh, how prosaic. No, you needed dark glazed jian bowls with opulent patterns specifically designed to provide a striking visual contrast to the froth. Leading the charge of this imperial obsession was Emperor Huizong himself, a ruler who was so steeped in the culture that he wrote his own treatise, the Daguan Chalwan, or Grand View Tea Discourse. If you asked a historian, they would likely say Emperor Huizong was an ineffective, absentee emperor, abdicating responsibility to his advisors while he busied himself with artistic pursuits, such as the aforementioned four elegances. But if you were to ask a tea historian, they would likely say he was a genius and notable tea historian himself. He spent most of his life dedicating himself to what he considered only the most genteel endeavours, and transcribed most of what he learned, and, whether intentionally or unintentionally, created the most comprehensive history of tea, excluding Lu Yu's earlier writings. In the late 1300s, after the fall of the Song dynasty, founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, issued an imperial decree completely banning the pressed tea cakes everyone was accustomed to from the imperial tribute system. He thought the labour-intensive process of pressing and fermenting those dense bricks was too oppressive for agricultural workers, so he mandated a total shift to loose-leaf tea instead. This forced tea masters to do away with many of the techniques they'd spent centuries perfecting and develop an entirely new process. Because the leaves were no longer pressed into identical bricks or aged, people suddenly had to pay close attention to the raw product, which led to the profound realization that the harvest season dramatically affected the flavor profile. Instead of everything tasting like the uniform, heavy forest floor of post-fermented cakes, tea drinkers discovered that delicate early spring leaves offered light, floral nuances, while bolder summer flushes yielded a brisker, more robust cup. Of course, you can't just toss loose leaves into a bowl meant for whisking powdered tea without getting a mouthful of wet salad. So this shift necessitated a completely new category of teaware. Enter the teapot, which gracefully stepped into the spotlight as the central object of tea culture during this time. The real superstars of this era were the craftsmen in the city of Yixing, within the Jiangsu province, who discovered that the region's unique xixia, or purple sand, clay, was practically magic for loose-leaf brewing. This porous clay absorbed tea oils over time, retained heat, and didn't leach unwanted mineral flavours into these dainty new profiles, making Yixing pots the absolute must-have gear for any self-respecting enthusiast. It didn't take long for these elegant teaware pieces and the rapidly expanding literature surrounding them to become status symbols among the Chinese elite. Wealthy collectors began aggressively seeking out and preserving these masterly crafted pots. Accompanying this was a boom in sophisticated tea manuals and poetry, as tea connoisseurs looked to codify their refined lifestyles and outline precise brewing methodologies like diancha or gongfu-cha, when and how to pick the best leaves, where the best water came from, and so on. Owning a beautifully curated tea collection or a rare treatise wasn't just about showing off your wealth. It was about signalling that you possessed the high-minded, artistic sensibility and philosophical depth required to truly appreciate the process. By the 1600s, under the Qing dynasty, China had achieved something almost unprecedented in economic history: a total global monopoly on the most coveted beverage on earth. From the 17th through the mid-19th centuries, if anyone on the planet wanted a proper cup of tea, they had to play strictly by the Qing court's rules. To keep Western traders from muddying up the domestic social order, the empire established the Canton system. This restricted all foreign maritime commerce to a single port in Guangzhou, Canton, and funneled it exclusively through an elite, state-sanctioned merchant guild known as the Hongs. From the imperial perspective in Beijing, this was a magnificent setup. Westerners brought ships packed to the brim with silver bullion, the only payment the Qing state cared to accept, and left with holds full of tea. This created a huge trade surplus that saw mountain ranges of silver accumulate inside Chinese treasuries, making tea the ultimate geopolitical economic engine, transforming a leaf into the backbone of China's export dominance. However, China was not the only party who realised how lucrative this arrangement was for them. Increasingly dependent on Chinese tea, but thoroughly depleted of the silver required to buy it legally, the British East India Company did something downright villainous: illegally smuggling opium grown in colonial India into China's coastal regions. Opium had been used medicinally in China for centuries up to that point, but had recently gained widespread popularity as a recreational drug. The BEIC saw this increased demand and were happy to oblige the Chinese citizens. Of course, this drug cost money, and the BEIC was more than willing to accept silver and occasionally tea as payment. This worked ridiculously well for them. The economic tide had shifted, but at a cost that neither they nor the Qing government was initially prepared for. Whether the BEIC intended it or not, their actions were viewed by China as an act of war. The rampant influx of narcotics wrought socio-economic and public health havoc on the Chinese populace, and, faced with an addicted population and a draining treasury, the Qing government took a hard stance against the British Empire. When Imperial Commissioner Lin Zhu seized and destroyed massive illegal British opium stockpiles in Canton, the British responded not with diplomacy, but with gunboats. The resulting opium wars ended in crushing military defeats for the Qing forces, who were caught off guard by industrialized Western warfare. The peace terms were humiliating, one-sided treaties that hacked away at Chinese sovereignty. Under the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Great Britain and open multiple coastal treaty ports to foreign merchants, permanently blowing a hole in the Canton system. While the wars raged on the coast, British agents executed daring acts of industrial espionage in the interior, smuggling out thousands of tea plants and secret processing techniques. Combined with British efforts to establish rival plantations in India and Ceylon, The millennia-old global monopoly China had held over tea was broken. Yet, while the coastal ports burned and the global monopoly dissolved, China remained resilient and revived ancient methods in order to expand their overland trade routes. The pressed tea bricks of yore made a comeback, as they were much easier to transport. These were loaded onto caravans to travel the ancient tea horse road to Tibet and Central Asia. But because these overland journeys were long and humid, the tea underwent a unique microbial post-fermentation. Qing merchants quickly realized that, unlike delicate green teas that grew stale within a single season, these dried tea cakes actually improved over time, developing deeper, woodier and smoother profiles. They had unintentionally discovered pu'er, which became a highly sought-after commodity of immense value to collectors. In the centuries that followed this new world order for tea, China gradually re-established itself, but not as the sole source of tea trade in the world. That ship had sailed, literally. The British Empire had succeeded in their attempt to break China's grip on the maritime tea trade. But China, instead of trying to compete with the West by mass-producing cheap, low-grade black tea for foreign markets, chose to lean into what it had always done better than anyone else: unmatched artisanal variety and hyper-specific terroir. Central to this grand comeback was the refinement of Gongfu cha. Originating in the cultural hotbeds of Fujian and Guangdong, Gongfu cha was the modern embodiment of a millennia-old mindset, one that shifted the narrative from uninspired mass consumption back to elite sensory appreciation. China also showed its brilliant capacity for modern innovation by revolutionizing its dark, post-fermented categories to satisfy a booming population of global collectors. For generations, the Yunnan province had been trading sheng, or raw pu'er cakes, along the grueling tea horse road, relying entirely on natural yeasts and decades of patient aging to smooth out the leaf's initial bitterness. But in the 1970s, Chinese tea masters pulled off an agronomic miracle by inventing shu, or ripe pu'er. By implementing a highly controlled wet piling technique, where the leaves were intentionally dampened and covered to accelerate microbial activity, they figured out how to replicate the complex, earthy and smooth characteristics of a 30-year-old aged tea in a matter of weeks. This breakthrough completely democratized fermented tea, turning old and new cakes alike into extraordinarily valuable assets for collectors, while also making the process much less intensive for labourers, and in turn, much less expensive for regular people. Ultimately, China's journey is a masterclass in cultural endurance. They bounced back not by chasing the industrial, high-yield efficiency of the West, but by reminding the world that true tea appreciation is a synthesis of ancient tradition and rigorous organic science. By focusing on premium loose-leaf markets, intentional biodiversity, and preserving the sacred, unhurried rituals of communion and presence, China found a new niche in a world that now had unfettered access to tea, thanks to them. Empires can trade, raid, and copy how it's made, but history has proven that you can never truly clone the heart of the culture that gave it to the world. And that, my sweet buttercups, brings us to the final drop of episode 8. Thank you so much for hanging out, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the resilient spirit of tea and the people who brought it to us, hey, why not? You know, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That'd be pretty cool, I think. Anyway, ta-ta for now, friends, and remember, steep, sip, stay curious.